Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are not just dusting off some old, boring history books. Actually, we're diving into a full-on, silent rebellion. It was this incredible rebellion of the human mind against a world that for millennia had been governed entirely by myth, fear, and the unquestioned whims of the gods. We're talking, of course, about ancient Greece. It's the crucible where humanity quite literally learned how to think, how to govern, and how to fight in entirely new ways.
We've got a lot of fascinating ground to cover today. Here is our agenda. 1. Out of the Dark Ages. 2. The birth of reason. 3. Athens versus Sparta. 4. Daily life and society. 5. Golden Age to ruin. And finally, 6. An enduring Greek legacy. Let's get right into it.
Out of the Dark Ages, from myth to the polis. Now, before there was an ancient Greece, as we usually think of it, that region saw the rise and fall of two distinct, much earlier cultures. First, you had the Minoans on the island of Crete, a highly sophisticated, peaceful civilization famous for these labyrinth-like palaces, vibrant art, and a massive maritime trade network. Then came the Mycenaeans on the mainland. They were a lot more warlike, building enormous cyclopean stone fortresses and leaving behind these incredible gold burial masks. But right around 1100 BC, this whole world of early heroes and kings mysteriously just collapsed, ending in fire and ruin.
So, to understand how Greece actually rebuilt itself from that total collapse, historians broadly divide the timeline into three major chapters. You have the Archaic period, kicking off around 800 BC, which is where city-states first started forming. Then, the Classical period, starting in 480 BC, that's the one you probably know best, marking the famous heights of democracy, art, and philosophy. And finally, the Hellenistic period, ushered in by the conquests of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, which lasted all the way until the Romans conquered Egypt in 31 BC.
But wait, what happened between the collapse and that first Archaic period? Well, 400. That is exactly how many years the Greek Dark Ages lasted after the Mycenaean collapse. 4 whole centuries where writing was completely lost, trade routes broke down, and the population severely declined. It sounds incredibly bleak, right? But paradoxically, this intense isolation planted the seed for a revolutionary new concept. Because they were separated by rugged mountains and seas, the Greeks decentralized. They organized themselves around the polis, the independent city-state.
Moving to Section 2, the birth of reason, the dangerous question. You see, the polis wasn't just a dot on a map, it was a living, breathing community of citizens. If you wanted to make laws, decide on going to war, or even judge a neighbor, you had to speak in public in the agora, the central gathering space. Persuasion, debate, and logic became absolutely essential tools for political survival. You couldn't just throw up your hands anymore and say, well, the gods willed it. You had to actually make a case.
And this completely new environment triggered a literal intellectual earthquake. A man named Thales came along and asked a wildly subversive question. What if everything is not just a divine whim, but a comprehensible order? He started seeking natural explanations for things, suggesting that everything ultimately proceeds from a single fundamental principle. He believed that principle was water, simply because it's essential for life and it exists in solid, liquid, and gas forms. For the very first time, he was replacing myth with natural observation.
That one shift in thinking basically opened the floodgates for a whole wave of other thinkers. You had Heraclitus arguing that the universe is in a state of constant change and tension. He's the one who famously stated, "War is the father of all things." But then, in stark contrast, another thinker named Parmenides argued that change is literally just an illusion tricking our senses. This intense back-and-forth debate over the true nature of reality eventually led thinkers like Leucippus and Democritus to develop the world's very first atomic theory. Yeah, they came up with the incredibly modern idea that everything is made of infinite, invisible, uncuttable particles just colliding in a void, all through pure reasoning.
Which brings us to Section 3, Athens versus Sparta, the polar superpowers. Because look, Greece wasn't just one giant philosophy club. Let's talk about the brutal reality of power. These two mainland heavyweights emerged from the Archaic period as absolute superpowers, but they had radically, fundamentally different priorities and ways of life.
The absolutely crucial thing to remember here is that ancient Greece was not a single unified country. It was a fiercely competitive arena. Just look at the contrast. Athens embraced direct democracy for its male citizens, poured its resources into a powerful navy of triremes, kept its women mostly confined to the domestic sphere, and heavily prioritized an education in arts, philosophy, and rhetoric. Sparta, total opposite. They ran a strict oligarchy. They prioritized a terrifyingly effective land army. gave their women public physical education and way more rights so they could produce strong citizens, and controlled all education with a ruthless militaristic curriculum. They were literally night and day.
And Sparta's militaristic might became legendary around the whole world, best symbolized by one number, 300. During the massive Persian Wars, when the colossal Persian Empire tried to invade Greece, 300 highly trained Spartan hoplites, led by King Leonidas, held off hundreds of thousands of Persian troops for 3 entire days at the narrow pass of Thermopylae. It stands today as the ultimate display of Spartan discipline and bravery.
All right, Section 4, Daily Life and Society, Beyond the Battlefield. We've talked about the big ideas and the big wars, but while the Spartans were fighting and the Athenian philosophers were debating, what was everyone else actually doing? Let's step beyond the battlefield and check out everyday life.
If you walked through a typical Greek town, you'd see that most houses were built pretty simply, from stone or sun-dried clay with tiled roofs. The larger homes were planned entirely around a central open-air courtyard. That was the absolute focal point of family life. And interestingly enough, men and women lived in very different separated parts of the house, with women generally occupying the back or upstairs areas, which perfectly reflects those strict domestic roles we were just talking about in Athens.
When it came to their wardrobes, the Greeks kept it practical. They wore light, loose garments that were just perfectly suited for that hot Mediterranean climate. The go-to item was a tunic made of linen in the summer or wool when it got cold in the winter. These weren't tailored suits. They were essentially large squares of cloth fastened with pins at the shoulders and tied with a simple belt. It was ancient Greece's wonderfully comfortable, breathable answer to the heat. And because buying finished cloth at the market cost a fortune, these clothes were almost always made right at home by women and female slaves.
And of course, we can't forget what actually fueled this civilization. The Greek diet relied heavily on the classic staples of the region: olives, olive oil, and hearty breads. We really have to keep in mind that this simple, highly relatable daily reality, all the cooking, the cleaning, the fetching of water, which was predominantly done by female slaves in most households, provided the very foundation that allowed the men of the polis the free time to actually go participate in politics and wage those epic wars.
Moving on to Section 5, Golden Age to Ruin, Hubris and the Fall. After a coalition of those Greek city-states miraculously managed to defeat the invading Persian Empire, Athens entered its famous Golden Age. But here is a truly fascinating detail. To protect against future attacks, Athens formed a maritime alliance, basically collecting protection funds from 150 other cities. The famous Parthenon, that magnificent, iconic marble temple on the hill, it was actually built in large part to function as a literal central bank to hold this vast imperial treasury.
Funded by all this immense wealth, Athenian culture completely exploded. It's right here in the Golden Age that we see the incredible lineage of the 3 greatest philosophers. First up is Socrates, who famously roamed the streets questioning absolutely everything and turning philosophy inward to focus on ethics and human virtue. Eventually, he was executed by the state. His traumatized student, Plato, decided the physical world couldn't be trusted. It was just an imperfect shadow of a perfect world of ideas. And then came Plato's own brilliant student, Aristotle, who rejected that transcendent world entirely. Aristotle chose instead to be a hardcore empiricist, aggressively observing and categorizing the physical, natural world right in front of him.
To explain absolutely anything in the universe, Aristotle argued that you just needed to identify its 4 causes: the material cause, what it's made of; the formal cause, its design or essence; the efficient cause, what actually made it; and the final cause, its ultimate purpose. This system of rigorous deductive logic was so remarkably complete that it dominated Western and Arab thought for the next 2,000 years. It's just wild to think about.
But as history often shows us, the Golden Age just could not last. Sparta and its allies grew incredibly jealous and fearful of Athenian power, which sparked the catastrophic Peloponnesian War. This brutal conflict dragged on for nearly 30 agonizing years. Athens was besieged, a terrible plague wiped out a full third of its population, and in the end, they suffered a completely humiliating defeat. In fact, it was in the deep, paranoid despair following this 30-year disaster that a traumatized Athens actually voted to execute Socrates in the first place.
Finally, Section 6, An Enduring Greek Legacy, to the Ends of the Earth. The absolute devastation of the Peloponnesian War left the traditional Greek city-states completely exhausted, bankrupt, and vulnerable. And that paved the exact way for a new, semi-barbarian power from the north to just sweep right in, the Macedonians. King Philip of Macedon united Greece by force, but it was his son, who, by the way, was personally tutored by Aristotle himself, who would absolutely change the globe. Alexander the Great blazed a massive trail of conquest all the way from Egypt to the borders of India. But he didn't just conquer and destroy, he built new cities and aggressively exported Greek culture, blending it seamlessly with Eastern traditions, which created an entirely new historical era.
So, with Alexander, we officially leave behind the classical Greece of fiercely independent city-states, loud citizen assemblies, and local hoplite armies. In its place, Alexander left what we call the Hellenistic world. These were sprawling, vast empires where Greek and Oriental gods were blended together. Greek became the universal language of administration all across Asia, and kings were now worshipped as living gods.
Eventually, the Roman Empire would come along and conquer these Hellenistic kingdoms. But the Romans themselves were so captivated by Greek culture that they ended up spreading its literature, its architecture, and its philosophy across their entire known world. So, the ultimate takeaway here is this. The Greeks permanently changed the rules of the game. They gave humanity the audacity to question everything, which leaves us with one final thought for today. If the bold proposition of human reason could rise from the rugged mountains of ancient Greece to completely shape the modern mind, what pillars of our own world are just waiting to be examined by you? Thank you so much for exploring this with us. Keep questioning.